I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the continuing debate over President Obama's deal with Iran on its nuclear weapons program. On April 2nd, when the president told the world that Secretary of State John Kerry, working with the P5+1, had arrived at a negotiated framework of understanding with Iran, which the president argues will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Here's what the president said.
Today, the United States, together with our allies and partners, has reached a historic understanding with Iran, which, if fully implemented, will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. There will be strict limits on Iran's program for a decade. Additional restrictions on building new facilities or stockpiling materials will last for 15 years. The unprecedented transparency measures will last for 20 years or more. Indeed, some will be permanent. And as a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran will never be permitted to develop a nuclear weapon.
In Mr. Obama's words, Iran will never be permitted to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been extremely critical of this deal, arguing that it leaves Iran's nuclear infrastructure in place and will therefore not prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weaponized state. And there are many in the Jewish community who believe in Mr. Netanyahu and who, following his lead, now argue that Mr. Obama is naive or that he's been duped by a fanatic religious Iranian regime which has no intention of relinquishing power and remains dedicated to the eradication of Israel and through its funding of global terrorism, to extending its ideology and its control over the entire Middle East, if not the entire world. So who's right? Mr. Obama, who says the deal will prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, or Mr. Netanyahu, who says the deal with Iran will pave the way to Iran's becoming a nuclear weapon state? Should American Jewry and Americans in general be supportive of this deal or critical of it? Well, for some expert opinion and analysis, I'm most pleased to have on our phones right now from New Jersey, Professor David Menashri, who is both the founding director for the Alliance for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and he's a visiting fellow at Princeton University. David is also specialized in the social and political history of modern Iran and in Islamic radicalism. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
David, I want to ask just a general question. From your perspective, is the current deal, in your opinion, a good deal or a bad deal? Are you critical of the deal, or do you feel that this was the best deal that could have been worked out and you're very pleased with it? Where do you stand?
Well, I'll start with your permission with a brief introduction. When I was consulted about the candidate to the presidency, Mr. Obama, in 2008, his idea about dialogue by some of my American friends, Jewish friends and others, I said that in my view, dialogue with Iran is good. I thought it's a legitimate and important way to try and solve the problem with Iranian nuclear program and with the American-Iranian relations, which is unfortunately has gone to the situation that it is now there for 36 years. Even later, I was very pleased, and with this idea of dialogue. But the assumption of myself and others who supported this was that America will not turn its back to Israel and its other allies in the Middle East.
Yes.
And that America will not allow Iran to be nuclear with a cautious stamp by the United States as its European ally. Since then, we received this framework agreement. The framework agreement, and depends which version you choose to accept or believe.
Uh-huh.
There is American version and the Persian version, Iranian version. When I read one published in Washington, it's one thing. When I read what the Iranians published and say, it's totally different. So
Very
there is a basic difference between what each side believed it achieved. And I give a couple of examples. This agreement was supposed to be verifiable. Now, there is no way that it can be verifiable when the Iranians claim that on the military sites, or they will not allow any inspection. This is red line. The Americans say that the sanctions would be lifted gradually after this final agreement is signed end of June. If it's being signed there, the Iranians say no, it should be immediately.
Yes.
Now the Americans stand, and I heard what the President Obama said just a day ago, that there should be a way to take into account the Iranian concerns and accommodate and so on and so forth. And I think that the situation today, it seems to me, is that the United States and Iranian negotiating team, the President and the Foreign Minister, were very, very eager to sign the framework agreement. Reaching an agreement was more important, as it seems, than what is written in the agreement. It's like a young couple, the bride and groom, are happy to get engaged, but the parents, or whoever consider himself to be the parents, are not satisfied. On the Iranian side, it's the supreme leader, and the American side, we have voices in the Congress, in other communities, other circles, who are, even if they are not totally against the agreement, they are not pleased with the wording of the current agreement and to what degree it can be verified and implemented.
If the deal were, as you read it coming out of Washington, David, would you have felt it was an adequate agreement?
I would have maybe accepted what has been published by Washington as a deal, as a possible deal, but my concern is the life has its own way to in practice. When you go and give them A, B, C, and D, next time that you meet, they begin with what you agreed plus, and will demand more. And knowing the Iranians and knowing how eager the Americans are to make this deal, I am now a bit concerned that it may lead to an agreement which may pave the way to the Iranians to get nuclear capabilities and be a threshold nuclear state. And I think in many ways they are already there. So one of the reasons that people accepted this agreement or were willing to make the agreement, because Iran is already has the know-how. It's not, there is nothing that it's irreversible. On the other hand, if you lift sanctions, it's also irreversible. So if it was possible to really do what the Americans say they achieved, that the sanctions would not be lifted prior to significant practical steps taken by the Iranian side, it was something else. Right now, what we hear from April 2nd on means that the Iranians are really having their own interpretation and imposing it on the 5+1.
David, talk to me for a moment about sanctions from your perspective. On the one hand, the Brookings Institute writes that the sanctions were crippling Iran and were the reason Iran came to the negotiating table. But the president has said the sanctions were not working well enough to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, and therefore reimposing those sanctions would not be an effective means of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon in the future. What's your analysis of the effectiveness the sanctions had, and what do you say to Mr. Netanyahu or others in the Jewish community who argue that the real club that P5+1 had would be to say to Iran, unless you comply with all of our stipulations, the sanctions, the crippling sanctions, will not be removed. It was not a matter of, we'll go to war with you, but it was a view of some that the sanctions themselves, if they had been maintained, would have put an end to Iran's nuclear weapons program. What do you believe is the truth?
Well, here I can be very clear, I think. The sanctions were very, very effective in pressuring hard on the Iranian government. The Iranian government, unlike what many people think, they are pragmatic. Though pragmatic does not mean moderation. Mm-hmm. Wherever there is a clash between interest and ideology, they opted for interest. The question how much you pressure them. And I think that the pressure of the sanctions was the single most important cause that the Iranians entered 2 years ago into more serious negotiations.
Yes.
So this has been very, very effective. Now, if you lift the sanction, or if you just speak about it, you basically break the alliance that you created with the European countries. Mm-hmm. If there is one thing that surprised the Iranians, is the transatlantic alliance as a unity of action between Iran and the European countries. I don't know where it stands today when China is already selling arms to Iran, and I believe that European companies and maybe Americans are already finding ways into the market in Iran. So the atmosphere created in these 3 months is acting against the interest who wanted to use sanctions and pressure to make Iran conform with what they thought is a good deal.
Mm-hmm. It sounds to me like you do not believe the kind of crippling sanctions that had been in place could be reimposed. Am I correct?
To be honest with you, I don't think so.
Yes.
I don't think it can be reimposed. Even they have not been yet lifted, there is the atmosphere created, and there is the mood that they are going that way. And I think more than the wording of one or another agreement, the mood and atmosphere are significant.
What I'm trying to get from you, and I'm not pushing you in one direction or another, but what I am hoping to get from you, David, is some advice for American Jewry. We have seen the Prime Minister of Israel be extraordinarily critical, not only of Iran going nuclear, but he's been critical of the way in which the Obama administration has been willing to negotiate the entire affair. And he says to us now, the deal that's on the table will pave the way for Iran to go nuclear. If that's true, you can't call this a good deal. And what I'm asking from you is, with all of your expertise, experience, both personal and professional, should American Jews view this as a good deal, a bad deal? Should we be disappointed? Should we say this is the best deal we could have gotten, but the bottom line is it will in fact pave the way for Iran going nuclear, and really that's a foregone conclusion, and the best we can do is delay the process? That's the kind of analysis I want from you. What do you view the deal to be, and how would you have American Jewry, world Jewry, and all, the West in general, Americans in general, how should we now view this deal? Should we be critical or should we be celebrating?
Mark, there is no good deal.
There's no good deal.
Iran has reached a situation in which there is no good deal. Mm-hmm. There is nothing, in my view, that can stop Iran from going nuclear.
Yes.
And even Netanyahu, in his speech in the Congress, said this in the best possible way. No one can introduce this better than Netanyahu, because Iran is already on the way to be there. Now, even military attack will not stop Iran from getting nuclear. So that's my dilemma, because it is no good deal. What you can do to have the best possible deal, and what you ask me is that from what I heard on April 2nd, and from what I hear since then on, and the position that the Iranians are coming to the second round of the negotiations, the situation is going to be even worse than we ended in April 2nd. And there are signs that the Americans are willing to comply, to take into consideration more seriously the Iranians. So deal is good. The agreement is good. The question, what the agreement gives you.
You know, recently he did an interview with Thomas Friedman for the New York Times, a television interview. And in that interview, he basically said that it's not simply if something happens on his watch, but if something that happened on his watch in the future will in some way make Israel more vulnerable, the president will consider that a personal failure.
I would consider it a failure on my part, a fundamental failure of my presidency, if on my watch, or as a consequence of work that I've done, Israel was rendered more vulnerable.
Not just a strategic failure.
And I think that's not just a strategic failure, I think that would be a moral failure.
When he says something like that, David, it sounds like he's committed to keeping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and protecting the state of Israel. At the same time, there are many American Jews who have been so disappointed with the president, who feel that he has not been strong enough in his support of Israel in general and of Mr. Netanyahu in particular. And very many American Jews actually vilify the president of the United States. When you hear the president tell Thomas Friedman that he will consider it a personal failure if anything that happens on his watch in the future will work to the detriment of the state of Israel, do you believe him? And do you believe that in some way he tried as hard as he could to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
I believe that he sincerely wants to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That's not the question. In my view, it's not a question that he wants. So the question is your policy is really paving or preventing the way from Iran to get there? I think it was possible to have a much, much better deal. It still is possible. You need your allies to go with it, and you need the determination to go with it. And I don't see it right now. I don't see it in the statement that coming from Washington.
Yes.
For example, when Secretary of State Kerry states that the hard work is behind us, knowing the Iranians and how they should be treated in dialogue, in negotiations, I don't think that is. I think it's very optimistic.
Yes.
I think the hard work is still to come, provided you want to insist on what you say that there are red lines from your side.
Okay. And David, was the big mistake easing the sanctions when Iran came to the table? If there were one moment in time you wish we could have back, is that the moment?
No, I think, Mark, is beyond it. I think that the moment that the Americans say that one way or another, we want this deal with the Iranians, this became the ideal. This became the target. Then all the others are less relevant. And I think that the main mistake, in my view, was that this determination that Iranians felt that the Americans are willing, eager to have an agreement. You signal to them that, and I can only quote the Wall Street Journal from today, that Khamenei got an assurance that now you can ask whatever you want.
Yes.
And I think this is the sense that the Iranians have heard from during the negotiations leading to 2nd April and since then.
Yes. David, you're an Israeli. Your family is Israeli. You're convinced it's only a matter of time now before Iran does have a nuclear weapon, correct?
Yes, if they want, yes. If they will decide that they want it, it's a question of time.
Does it frighten you?
Well, I can give you an indirect answer, which will be much more, I think, convincing. 5 years ago, at the Center of Iranian Studies, I conducted a survey of public opinion about, and one of the questions was, how seriously you take the Iranian threat, or what is called existential threat, and what you will do if Iran goes nuclear. 1 of 4 Israelis say that if Iran goes equipped with nuclear weapon, they will consider leaving the country. Mm-hmm. So it's not me or others. The Iranian threat is very significant. It's very dangerous. No matter what you think about dialogue on the way of resolving this issue, the combination of such a radical regime holding nuclear weapon on the other side, on the other hand, is unacceptable for Israelis. This will make life miserable, regardless of the question whether or not the Iranians would use it. You can think they would use, they would not use. Well, of course, this is the main question. But what will happen the day Iran is getting nuclear weapon? Mm-hmm. The nuclear race in the Middle East, the umbrella that Iran will give to non-state or state clients that they already have. And they made clear recently that their sphere of atmosphere goes from the Mediterranean to Yemen. So if a country with this ideology, would radical as it is, and today you have Rouhani, which is a bit nicer. Yesterday you had Ahmadinejad, whom you are going to get tomorrow. Mm. If you are looking for hope for Iran, it's not in the administration in Tehran. Mm. It's in the civil society, in the young people of Iran. Young people of Iran are resentful of this regime, are fed up. And that's why I think the sanctions were dangerous for the Iranians, because the young people of Iran are disillusioned, dissatisfied with the realities of their life. As I mentioned earlier, they wish the revolution was about to give them brighter hope. And they failed to do it so far. So I think that, but you cannot wait until the young people will change the policy of this regime. Now, what I see in Iran is that there are 2 trains that already have left the terminal. One train is carrying the message of nuclear weapon, and the other train is carrying the message of political change in Tehran. Unfortunately, the train with nuclear weapon is driving much, much faster, and what happened in the last month is actually paving the way for this train to go faster and reach the final station before the young people are able to say something about the realities of their life in Tehran.
Okay. David, you give us such a clear picture. And then I'm saying to myself, as an Israeli, are you pessimistic about the future of the state of Israel in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, these are questions that we ask ourselves all our life. Mm-hmm. The fact that I live in Israel and my family are in Israel is probably sufficient to say that we are not concerned of the existence of the state of Israel. I even went public saying that this term, existential threat, is not a good term, because my answer is, when I ask, so how you would respond to this threat, I would say my response will be that Israel is indestructible. That's our answer should be to the Iranians. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that it's not a most serious problem that we have today. It goes beyond it. Iran is now stretching its hand not only to Hamas and Hezbollah, and in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in other places. Listen, I would suggest to my American friends, listen to the Iranians in their own language, and it's being also translated. Their sphere of influence, they want to go back to a kind of empire that covers so many crucial issues in the Middle East. Listen to what Saudi Arabia says about the nuclear program in Iran, what the Egyptians say, Jordanians and other Arabs, the Sunni world. So I think that what we're seeing today is a major change in the Middle East, which Iran is using its arms, its Revolutionary Guard, its other agents to expand the sphere of influence in Iran.
David Menashri, it is wonderful to talk to you. I hope one day I can get you in studio and sit with you at the table and pick your brains even more, but you bring wonderful analysis and heart to the subject, and I thank you so very much for spending some time with us here on JBS.
Thank you. Thank you.
David Menashri, who again is the founding director of the Alliance for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and is also a visiting fellow at Princeton. There seems to be a consensus evolving here as you listen to many of the people who've spoken here on JBS, and the themes are, number one, the horse has left the barn. Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon. And the deal, first of all, the deal that America describes is not the deal that Iran is describing. But if there is a deal that is going to work at all, it's a deal that may postpone Iran's getting a nuclear weapon. And so we as American Jews have to understand it's not whether it's a good or bad deal. Person after person is saying the same thing. It seems that this deal, given the way everything evolved, the deal was the best deal possible at this point in time. And it may be that it will give Israel and the world a good 10, 15, maybe 20 years before Iran gets a nuclear weapon. And maybe, although David Menashri says the train that's left the station in Iran dealing with, the radical, extreme religious elements of the Iranian regime are going far faster than is the train that deals with perhaps a revolution coming out of the youth of Iran. Who knows whether in 10, 15 years there could not be a regime change in Iran and the entire picture will be very different. In any case, those are the thoughts of David Menashri. And as always, I invite you to be in touch with us with any thoughts of your own, please. Write me, email me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I always look forward to hearing from you. My thanks, as always, to Sloan Copeland, our director, Serge Goldberg, our production coordinator, to the JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to producers of this edition of In the News, Kara Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.